Today, the session will last 1 hour and 45 minutes. This is a joint event organized by ITU, GSMA, and GeSI in order to present the guidance that has been developed through several months at the long from last year and this year. Allow me to provide you some rules. Barnica, if you can put the next slide. Please make sure that you are connected to audio by using Teams. There will be an opportunity for question and answer after the presentation of each category and a final question and answer at the end. Throughout the webinar, participants are invited to send the questions via the chat window. Please note that your camera and microphone have been disabled. A recording of this webinar and material will be available to all participants, and we will share a link to the website where you can find all this information. Now, allow me to give the floor to Mr. Bilal Jamousi, Chief of ITUT Study Group Department from the International Telecommunication Union, that will provide us some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Reina, and good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Before we dive into the discussions, I'd like to take a moment to express my gratitude to some of the key players who have made this session possible. First, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to GeSI and GSMA for collaborating and putting together this information session. Moreover, I would like to express my appreciation to the experts from ITUT Study Group 5 that works on international standards for EMF, environment, climate action, sustainable digitization, and circular economy, and particularly its working group, we call it Question, on climate change and assessment of digital technologies in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, as well as the co-rapporteurs who have been instrumental in shaping the guidance that we will be discussing today. It's my pleasure to welcome those of you who are joining us from all over the world. Your presence here today demonstrates the global reach and impact of this important topic. The telecommunications and more broadly, the digital industry is essential in our modern lives and is growing rapidly. However, with growth comes challenges, and it is essential for the industry to take action on its impact on the environment. The ITU, in collaboration with GSMA and GeSI, has developed a guide to harmonize methods for telecommunication operators to assess and report their Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and increase coverage and transparency. This guide is crucial in helping the ICT sector to achieve the Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals. It is a significant step towards reducing GHG emissions and mitigating climate change. As significant players in the industry, telecommunications operators and their providers play a key role in decarbonizing the ICT sector. This guide will assist telecommunication operators in understanding their upstream and downstream emissions, identifying areas where they can reduce their footprint, and launching actions in cooperation with their providers to reduce the greenhouse gas emission on the whole value chain. The collaboration with GSMA and GeSI is a continuation of the great work done in the development of recommendation ITUT L.1470, greenhouse gas emissions trajectories for the information and communication technology sector, compatible with the UN FCCC Paris Agreement, which provides detailed 1.5 centigrade trajectories of greenhouse gas emissions for the global information and communication technology sector by 2030. This collaboration complements the efforts to help the ICT sector to lower its emissions by 2030. We are committed to making sure that we collectively achieve the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. In view of COP28, asking for solutions and actions, this guide is timely, and the industry is ready to take the necessary steps to mitigate climate change. Although this guide covers the part of telecommunication operators, ITU, together with GeSI, will continue the collaboration to work on the guidance for other key players, such as data center operators. We will continue working towards creating a sustainable future through the transformation and enablement of ICTs and digital technologies to support other sectors to reach net zero. With that, I hope you all enjoyed this informative session. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Jamousi, for your words. Now I would like to give the floor to Stephen Moore from Head of Climate Action of GSMA. Stephen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here this morning. As a small bit of history, I think the GSMA's work on this guidance stems from the net zero ambition that the board of the GSMA set back in 2019 to help move the entire mobile industry to net zero by 2050. As Bilal just mentioned, it follows on from the joint collaboration that the GSMA, GeSI, and the ITU worked on to develop the pathway to net zero carbon emissions for the ICT sector. And since the publication of this pathway, the GSMA has seen many mobile network operators aligned to it, and there are now more than 60 that are committed to science-based targets. Most of those are in line with 1.5 degrees. So with this commitment to a science-based target comes a requirement to set a target for Scope 3 emissions. And back in 2021, the feedback from our members was that this was proving very difficult to measure. So we created this working group to see if we could work together to improve the measurement of Scope 3 emissions. And one of the first things we did was to compare our members' current ways of measuring Scope 3. And I think what really surprised us was actually how the figures were extremely different. So there was clearly a need to look to align methodologies and guidance around the measurement and the sources, the databases that we're using to measure Scope 3. So fast forward to now, and I'm very happy to be launching the guidance today with our expert team who will be explaining how to use it. And I'd like to echo Bilal's words and say a huge thank you to our project leads who have very deftly steered this project to its conclusion. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to our project members who've contributed huge amounts of time and input into developing this guidance for telecommunication operators. I hope this is going to be another big step forward to meeting our net zero ambition. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Stevens, for your words. Now, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Chris Toppen from the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative with GeSI. Chris, good morning. You have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Rainer. I'm here representing GeSI this morning, and I would also echo much of what has already been said. From GeSI's perspective, the history of this project goes back to when one of the members of GeSI asked about the category 813 element of Scope 3 and how other members of GeSI were approaching this. And it became very apparent from those conversations and a small survey that we ran that this was being approached in very different ways by different companies, and even where they had their results verified by external auditors, that still resulted in a variety of ways of approaching it. So there was clearly an inconsistency here, and we worked with members of GeSI and also communicated with WRI at that stage to see if there'd be an interest in coming up with some sector-specific guidance. At that point, we learned that the ITU and GSMA had been having similar discussions across Scope 3, and as others have said, the previous very successful work that we did together on SBT targets led us to joining forces for a second time and developing this Scope 3 guidance. And if any of you were on the SBTI technical update call yesterday, which had I think over 500 participants on it, there were very, very many questions coming through on Scope 3 in the chat, and it is clearly an area that has great interest and demand for guidance. So we're delighted to have got to the stage where we're now putting this guidance forward, and we're also looking forward to taking the current guidance for telecommunication operators and evolving it further into to look at and guide data center operators as well. So with that, I'll pass back to Rainer. Thank you.
Many thanks, Chris. Now we would like, first of all, to thank again all the people that are connected. I see we are 95 people connected, which is a very good number. I hope you find this session interesting and you can learn a lot today from the guidance. As well, this guidance was shared with you in advance, so you can take a look and make the proper questions. If you can, Varnika, go to the next slide just to see the agenda for today. So on the agenda for today, we have the overview of the guidance document. Then it will be the presentation of categories 1 and 2 on purchase goods, services, and CapEx. Category 11, use of sold products. Category 8 and 13, upstream and downstream lease asset. All other categories, and a final question and answer. Please note that in each section, there will be a part on question and answer, and you can write your question in the box of the question and answer that you can find in Teams. Now, allow me to give the floor to Jean-Manuel Canet, co-rapporteur of question 9.5 and senior manager of Orange. He will lead us through the introduction to the Scope 3 guidance for telecommunication operators. Good morning, Jean-Manuel, you have the floor.
So good morning, Raina. Good morning, all. Thank you very much for giving the floor. So let's go to this overview of the guidance document. So Varnika, thank you so much. So I will start with some overview, some key messages on this document that we have been pre-publishing. So the Scope 3 emissions, as you know, they cover a wide range of economic activities that are divided into 15 categories by the GHG protocol. And estimating the Scope 3 emissions is difficult, since this refers to emission sources which are outside a company's direct control. And so it brings a lot of questions, as Chris has just mentioned. So the document that has been published, pre-published jointly by our three organizations, establishes a guidance to harmonize the methods for telecommunication operators to assess and report then Scope 3 GHG emissions, and so to increase coverage in the reporting of the Scope 3 emissions and transparency. We believe this is also a key step to facilitate action regarding the Scope 3 emissions and to have the possibility to reduce them at the right speed, the speed that is required by the Paris Agreement and IPCC recommendations. So as we will see this morning, this afternoon, the guidance prioritizes in particular the categories 1, 2, and 11, which address the life cycle impact of companies' portfolios. The categories 8 and 13, which are related to leads assets and which were mentioned a few minutes ago. And the category 3, which is related to energy and has a close link to scopes 1 and 2, although all categories are addressed. So this document is intended to supplement, not supersede, the existing standards. This is also an important point. Varnika, if we could please go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is just a reminder of the GAG protocol scope 3 categories. So there are 15 categories. You can see them here. The source of this diagram is the GAG protocol itself, and they are usually reported as they are referring to upstream activities as well as to downstream activities. And we will go through the different categories in the course of our session now. So if we could please go to the next slide. We have put here the guiding principles of this guidance. So let me go through all these guiding principles. So the first one is that goal is reduction. So estimating emissions should be used to drive the reduction efforts. We all know the importance to reduce the emissions at the right speed and with the right amount. And so this is the first important guiding principle. Goal is reduction. The second one is outspotting, that is to say, focus time and effort on largest emission sources. Then keep it simple. Use the simplest approach that will give required accuracy and best support reduction goals. Then scale. So covering more emissions can help with business decisions. Improve accuracy over time. Scope 3 is complex, and so data availability and quality are improving each year, year after year, let's say. Another guiding principle is suitable for all. That is to say that the document presents approaches for both beginners and those more advanced. Follow science-based principle. So this guidance is related to net zero standards from ISO, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and also the ITUT recommendations. And focus on mitigation. Another clear principle, carbon offsets, whether purchased by the telecommunication operator or supplier customer, shall not be considered as a valid means of reducing CO2 equivalent inventories. So if we could now go to the next slide. And I will now give the floor to Simon. Simon, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you, Simon.
Fantastic. Thank you. Just for those that I've not met, my name is Simon Anthony. I work for Telstra, and I have the pleasure of speaking on category 1 and 2 today. I would like to thank everyone who contributed to this guidance across the 3 organisations. Unfortunately, I don't have time to list everyone. However, I just wanted to especially thank Jana from A1 Telecom, Witold from Telenor, Wilfred from Zane, and Penilla from Ericsson that contributed heavily to this guidance. So as mentioned, category 1 and 2 are significant for our industry. So therefore, it is also one of the largest sections in this guidance document. And today, the intention is I'll be highlighting some of the key points in this section. So this is not designed to be a comprehensive overview of the guidance. However, we do have 10 minutes straight after for Q&A. So just in terms bit of ground setting. So what are categories 1 and 2 emissions? So as mentioned, the guidance is intended to build on the different standards and practices. We did find instances where the standards and practices don't always align. So at times we've had to make a decision in terms of, which standards and practices we are best suited to align with based on those principles discussed. Probably one of the most obvious decisions is that we chose to combine categories 1 and 2 of the greenhouse gas protocol. So these are the cradle to gate emissions of all products purchased and capital goods. So those not included in the categories 3 to 8 or listed under the special exclusions, which I'll talk about shortly. So essentially we decided to combine these 2 categories to provide one set of guidance. We found that this was more aligned with the practices that we had in our procurement functions and also helped to reduce some of the workload. One thing though is that while we've combined these categories, the intention is that they still should be reported as either category 1 or 2, and we should be not double counting these emissions across the 2 categories. And then quite simply, to determine whether to account for a purchase in category 1 or 2, it's recommended that companies should be following their financial accounting classification. So for example, your operational expenditure would be reported under category 1, and your capital expenditure is to be reported under category 2. I won't go into too much more detail there. However, guidance has also provided some definitions and some examples that are relevant to the sector. As I mentioned, we've called out some of the special exclusions, and we did spend a lot of time discussing what should be excluded in our industry. But I should say we started with the position that a telecom operator has responsibility for all of our upstream emissions. So that was our starting point. We did find that there are 2 types of payments which we could get agreement on that telecom operators may exclude. And these included things such as regulatory payments, fees and charges, etc. So anything required by a legal requirement or regulation. And the second was intercompany transactions. I won't go into too much detail on that. Once again, please refer to the guidance for further details. There were also several payments which we heavily debated through the process. So this included things such as roaming agreements, interconnects, and content and media licenses. It's recognised in the guidance that these are challenging areas for us to account for, but also that the approaches between organisations differed greatly. So as an industry, and I'm sure a number of you would have seen that there's a lot more work happening in this space to further align and develop more specific guidance on any other types of exclusions. The next key area that I'd like to highlight is around depreciation, discounted or amortized goods. So the decision was made that we would align with the greenhouse gas protocol here to ensure that the timely reporting of emissions. So that means the guidance we're recommending is that the emissions from the production of capital goods should not be depreciated, discounted or amortized. So we recognise as a result of this approach, some emissions may fluctuate from year to year due to purchases of exceptional or non-recurring capital goods. If this is the case for your organisation, the recommendation is that you should provide some commentary to help explain these variations. The next area was on reused, refurbished or repaired goods. This is a relatively new area. As we worked through it, there was certainly a number of complexities that were identified. And we're seeing the thinking in this area continue to evolve. So please take that as a bit of a disclaimer. Nevertheless, we were asked to provide guidance. So what we have said is that for reused, refurbished and repaired goods, just to clarify, in terms of first, we provided a bit of a definition of around what we mean by reused, refurbished, and repaired goods. And this means any items of property that were previously owned by another company and restored when necessary to a usable condition prior to the purchase by the telecom operator. So the emissions from purchased goods previously used should not be included in the emissions that arise from the original manufacturing. So what this means is that as the telecom operator purchasing used goods, we would only be accounting for any further processing. And there's a couple of examples in the guidance to explain that further. So one thing we did have to explicitly note is that when we're talking about reused, refurbished, and repaired goods, this does not include goods that are being purchased or acquired by a telecom operator as new after a cosmetic refurbishment, so where the item hasn't been used previously. And the intention here was to avoid any claims that the guidance may allow for the washing of emissions, essentially. Then moving on to the calculation methods, and as Stephen mentioned, a big piece of work was performed quite early in this process to understand how companies are calculating these emissions. And what we found was that there were 3 different methods frequently being used, and that these methods differed from general and simplistic to those that are more specific and detailed. And the 3 methods, which we've called in the document, were the industry average method, the supply level allocation method, and the product level method. So these are largely based on the greenhouse gas protocol, however, are more aligned with the practices of telecom operators and the principles discussed earlier, especially reducing emissions and hotspotting. Something also to note is that for companies, when they're using these methods, they can use a combination of them for different suppliers. However, we've also included some examples of where you can use these different calculations for the same supplier. So for example, there may be a supplier that provides network equipment and maintenance. The company may use a more detailed method on the network equipment component, and then they may use a less specific method for maintenance. And then once again, there's an example on both what we mean by that and how to calculate that in the guidance. So just going a bit further into each of those methods, the first method, so the industry average method, and that's using secondary emissions data, so your industry average emission factors or your EEIO factors. And what we found is this is to be the most cost and time efficient method, as the data requirements are less onerous, and as a result, we also found it to be the most frequently used method. However, the big challenge with this method is that the only way to reduce emissions using it is to reduce activity, which is not always an effective way to be running our companies or trying to reduce emissions. So certainly then, the guidance encourages a lot of organisations to continue to move from using industry average emission factors to supplier level allocation method, where we are seeing key suppliers in focus. And what we mean by the supply level allocation method is about collecting data from suppliers. Usually this was at a company level, but it can be at any type of level. But essentially what we're trying to do is obtain emissions data from suppliers. Obviously this can add a considerable cost and time burden. Therefore, we recommend that companies should be prioritising the collection of such data for products and capital goods that have a relatively high emission or that are of key strategic importance to your organisation. And then the last method, the product level method, is not quite as detailed as a life cycle assessment. We felt that wasn't pragmatic to be utilizing life cycle assessments all the time. So the intention is that this is more of a simplified life cycle assessment. As mentioned, there's benefits and challenges for each of these, and they're discussed in detail in the guidance documents. And it's important that organizations understand both those benefits and challenges of using each of the methods, especially in terms of kind of the effort versus the ability to reduce those emissions using each of those methods. So, Varnika, are you able to, move to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. In terms of being able to identify when we should be using each of the methods, we provided a decision flow chart, which starts with the screening of suppliers. And then, as mentioned, if we deem the suppliers or the products to be significant, then looking towards obtaining data from suppliers, whether that's using the supplier level allocation method, so that company average from the supplier, or the more product specific information. One thing that was discussed a lot was also, though, how do we ensure that we are obtaining the right data from suppliers? Because what we noted was that our ability to also reduce those emissions really depends on the quality of the information that we're getting. So having more relevant data in some cases may not be as helpful as having data of sufficient quality. And so what we've provided in the guidance is a list of criteria on how to determine whether the data under each of the methods is of sufficient quality. And the recommendation is that if it's not of sufficient quality, that we shouldn't be using that method. So for example, if we're obtaining data from our suppliers through something such as the Carbon Disclosure Project, however, the data that we've obtained isn't complete of our categories or scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, or hasn't, in some cases, been verified, then we may choose to default to using the industry average method until such a time when the supplier is able to provide complete emissions data to us. And then finally, we provide a breakdown in the guidance document of each of the different methods and how to calculate them. And also referring to the appendix, there's further detail and examples, especially around how to use the supplier allocation method as well. I will stop there, and Reina or Varnika, if we have any questions that have come through, I'll be happy to answer them now.
Hi, Simon. Yes, there was a question in the question and answer. Sorry, it's charging. It's about a clarification regarding purchase during the year or supply during the year. It was asked by Sudhir Agarbal. Sorry.
Yeah, great question. What we've said here is that it's recommended to use the purchase by the year being kind of the more pragmatic or easier way to obtain that information, especially because most organizations we found were obtaining it through their procurement sources.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers that question.
Maybe Sudhir, if you can write in the chat if that answered your question, that would be great. For the time being, we don't have any other questions, Simon. So there is another question that says, hi, does your study provide certified method to be used and industry supplier product from Florian Dussu?
And that is a really good question. No, that isn't included in the guidance. The ITU is actually working on guidance on that at the moment. So we've referred to that piece of work. So stay tuned, essentially. There will be, further guidance on that product, simplified LCA.
There is another question, Simon, on how to deal with suppliers that do not publish any of their carbon emissions.
So the obvious response to that is the intention is to encourage and work with them over time. Without obtaining that information, it is very difficult to reduce those emissions. This guidance doesn't explain, ways to engage suppliers. Hopefully that might be, a future piece of work looking at, different strategies in terms of how to engage and reduce emissions.
Okay, thank you, Simon. There is another question. There is a gap in purchase and receipt of goods during the year. Which data to be considered, purchase or received?
Yeah, I think that's kind of similar to the previous question. Once again, we're saying, to align with your financial accounting frameworks. That's both for, consistency, but also for a simplified approach. So certainly in my case, it is a lot easier to obtain the information in terms of when the transaction has been paid for.
Thank you, Simon. I think that question was also raised by the same by Sudhir that made the first question. Then there is another question on next to methodology. How can we better align on sources for industry or supplier emission factors?
Yeah, great question. I think we do provide a list of the different, databases. I would say these are not exactly recommended databases. These are the databases that we found organizations were using. What we found was that there is a significant degree of variability in those, and it's not always possible for us to be able to align. So what we actually are suggesting is that organizations work to move away from using those EIO type factors and towards engaging their suppliers, because ultimately one of the biggest principles of this guidance was having the ability to reduce emissions, and that is the challenge with the EIO factors, is that they are using industry averages, and we are not able to influence or work with our suppliers. Or certainly if we do influence or work with our suppliers, we're not going to be capturing the benefits from any of those types of emission reduction activities or being able to track and measure them.
Thank you, Simon. There is another question. There have been a lot of questions now. How should suppliers claim be verified? Is there an obligation for them to publish the calculation method and its associated assumption?
So yeah, in the guidance, we provide a number of different clarifications that we should be checking with our suppliers. I'm just checking it, but for our level of assurance that we've recommended, I don't want to say it wrong. So we're talking about at least limited assurance. So that means that the company would have their methodology assured by a third-party auditor. The other thing that we've also said, or that I would recommend doing is, yeah, definitely having a look to see, if any of those numbers are incredibly abnormal looking. That makes sense. certainly by being able to review the information that the suppliers provided us, and if required, reaching out and engaging with suppliers. That's not something that we've included in the guidance, but something certainly that I would recommend is double checking the data that's being provided and reaching out to suppliers where you think it may need to clarify, because there's certainly cases where supplier may have accidentally provided you, if you're requesting information directly, they may have, fat fingers, errors, those kind of things is definitely been in my experience. So it's worth reviewing that information.
One last question, Simon, so we keep the time. Is there guidance on when to include the supplier's own Scope 3 emission in estimation their contribution to the operator's Scope 3 Category 1 emissions?
Yes. So under the calculations, it goes into that. What we've provided is there's two methods. One is based on economics, so spend. So that would be a case of taking, for example, your spend divided by the total revenue of the supplier, and then timesing that. Taking the supplier's emissions, dividing it by their revenue, and then timesing by your spend. So essentially, you're creating a supplier's emission factor. And then the other way that it could be done is on activity data. So, for example, if you've got something like a consulting firm, they may provide the hours that they would have been working for you. So they would take the number of hours provided service divided by the over the total number of consulting hours that they've provided as an organization.
We still have 2 minutes for this session. Simon, let me ask a last question that it just came. How accurate do you believe the supplier level method is when a supplier has a diverse portfolio of goods and services? This approach assumes all goods and services have the same emission profile. Could EEIO factors could be more accurate in some cases?
Yes, that is true. There may be some cases where the EEIO factor is more accurate in regards to the specific products that you're buying if you're purchasing from a supplier that doesn't provide a homogeneous group set or set of products. The challenge, though, is once again, we're not able to influence or reduce those emissions. So I would encourage organisations to kind of take that step where we might be sacrificing some more accuracy for the ability to be able to reduce emissions in line with our SBTI targets.
Simon, if you allow me, there are 3 more questions that came just now. Maybe we can answer them, but we close this session with the last question that was sent by Gulsaib Miyan. But we have 3 questions. One is, how many suppliers are to be considered in these categories?
I assume we're referring to how many suppliers should we be reaching out to obtain, emissions data. What we've said in the guidance, and this is just as an example, based on what I was hearing from organisations, is that most organisations are kind of targeting their top 80% of spend.
Thank you, Simon. From Pradit Mahat, he's asking, may companies selling 14 days return products as refurbished, sometimes even the packages are not open. Is there any way to account this?
Yeah, so that is kind of what we were trying to exclude when we're talking about reused, refurbished goods. So the intention is that we wouldn't be considering that as a used good. So we should be accounting for the full emissions of those.
Okay, last question. Is it acceptable to create customized industry emission factors by considering emissions of a sample of companies in a sector?
it's not something that had come up in the industry guidance and the conversations that we've had, but yeah, certainly an interesting approach. So yeah, sorry, I can't provide a comment on that one, and it's not something that we discussed.
Okay. Thank you so much, Simon. We are going to close for now the question and answer session. There will be an opportunity to ask more questions at the end of the different explanation of the categories. So now I would like to give the floor to Chris Toppen from GeSI. Chris will explain us category 8 on upstream lease assets and category 13 on downstream lease asset. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rainer. So again, like categories 1 and 2, we're combining 2 categories together here. Category 8, which concerns emissions associated with leasing an asset, and category 13, which is where the network operator is leasing an asset to someone else. So in the terminology of the greenhouse gas protocol, my screen has gone backwards on the slide. The same for everyone else? Yeah, there we go. Thank you. In the terminology of the greenhouse gas protocol, when a company rents an asset owned by somebody else, then they are the lessee. And when the company rents an asset to someone else, then they're termed the lessor. This terminology comes from the greenhouse gas protocol and flows through this chapter. There are a number of examples relevant to telecommunication operators in the guidance. Let me just pick up on a couple by way of illustration. So in the mobile world, it is very common to rent space from a tower company, a towerco. In that case, if you are renting space from a towerco, then you are the lessee. You may actually be renting space within your own towers to another telecom operator, in which case you would be the lessor. Some telecom operators run data centers and rent out space in their data centers using the colo data center model. And again, if you do that, then you'd be the lessee. Alternatively, you may actually be renting space within another data center, run by somebody else, in which case you'd be the lessor. And as I say, there's a number of examples within the guidance of the different ways in which this is relevant to network operators. The approach to determining whether emissions sit in categories 8, 13, and indeed scopes 1 and 2 is complex within the greenhouse gas protocol. And the division between who reports emissions as scope 1 and 2 and who would report them as scope 3, whether they were category 8 or 13, is sometimes unclear. And sometimes the greenhouse gas protocol is actually inconsistent within itself. Some of the factors that need to be taken into account when looking at this is the approach the company uses to set its organizational boundaries. You might use the equity share approach, the financial control approach, or the operational control approach. That's one factor area. Another is the types of lease that we're dealing with. So there are essentially two types of lease, a finance or capital lease being one, and an operating lease being another. A capital lease is essentially where the leased asset ends up on the financial books, on the balance sheet of the company, and an operating lease is essentially where it doesn't. And this would depend also on the accounting approach that you use. So I won't go into all the detail here, but the bottom line of it all is that at times, if you strictly follow the greenhouse gas protocol, there are occasions where, in fact, neither party, neither the lessor nor the lessee, would be reporting it as Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And also times when both parties would be reporting it as Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Clearly, this doesn't make sense. So within our guidance, we have essentially said that by agreement between the lessor and the lessee, one of the parties reports as Scope 1 and 2, the emissions associated with the asset, and the other party reports it as Scope 3. And depending on whether they are the lessee or the lessor, depends whether it goes into category 8 or 13. The greenhouse gas protocol does allow the determination of this be placed within a contract. So whenever you are leasing an asset, or in either direction, there will always be a written contract, and within that contract, the greenhouse gas protocol allows a clarification of ownership and responsibility for the emissions, and the distribution of the emissions between, or the allocation of emissions between Scopes 1 and 2 and Scope 3. So we, within the guidance, make a strong recommendation that between the two parties and within the contract, the emissions are allocated between one party reporting as Scope 1 and 2 and the other party reporting as Scope 3. And the greenhouse gas protocol allows this, and we consider and recommend this is actually the best way of approaching it. And you can approach that by negotiation when you negotiate the lease. There may be occasions within a particular leasing arrangement where one party takes some of the Scope 1 and 2 and the other party takes the other part of the Scope 1 and 2. For example, in a tower co situation, the company that is placing its own equipment within the tower and receives electricity to run that equipment from the owner of the tower, from the tower co, may report that as Scope 1 and 2, whereas the shared services, for example, the cooling of that equipment, may be reported as Scope 1 and 2 by the lessor. So in this way, you have a mix of attributions, but again, that's fine, and it can be included within the leasing contract. So then who measures the emissions? Then the emissions essentially are best to be measured by the entity that is reporting it as scope 1 and 2. And that entity informs the other entity as to what those emissions are and its share of those emissions associated with this particular leasing contract. And that second entity then reports them as scope 3. All of this then requires some specific wording to be included in the leasing contracts. And we have worked with a project, an initiative called the Chancery Lane Project, which is a group of lawyers that offer guidance and advice on contractual wording on all sorts of different aspects associated with climate change. And they have very kindly provided us with some draft contract clauses that you can refer to and use within your contracts to address this allocation matter. They are currently being finalized and will be available, and a link will be placed in the final version of the guidance itself. And you will be able to find them on the Chancery Lane project website. This is a complicated area, and we have tried our best to offer a straightforward and simple way through the maze of the greenhouse gas protocol as it stands today. And there is at the end of the of this chapter within the guidance, there's a summary of the decision steps that you take in order to flow through the process and come up with your determined approach to take. So with that, I will close and offer to answer any questions that may have come up. Are there any questions, Rainer?
Yes, Chris, there is one question. Let me read it. It's a long question. If lease and lessor use different organizational boundaries, one using equity share and other operational control, then also it will require to ensure between the two parties are reporting in 1 and 2 and scope 3. For example, lessor using equity share may be reporting in scope 1, and say lease is using operational control, then they will also be reporting in scope 1. So I think it was also more as a, also as a comment than a question.
Yes, and that is exactly an example of the situation where you can get double counting of scope 1 and scope 1 or 2 if you strictly follow the greenhouse gas protocol. And as the questioner is highlighting, it doesn't make sense for both parties to be reporting as scope 1 and 2. And therefore, this is exactly why we introduced the approach of resolving it through the contract, and that effectively we say only one party should ever report it as scope 1 and 2. And in that case, the other party should report it as scope 3. But that answered the question, isn't it? Or addressed the comment, perhaps I should say.
We don't have any other comment, so I guess it was addressed. And we don't have any other question for you right now in the chat, Chris. So let me see again the question and answer, just to be sure. Yeah, there is one more question that came just now. Can a tower company be classified as lessor and operator using the tower be classified as lease? Should I repeat the question? Yes.
Can you repeat the question? I can't see these questions.
You have to. There is in the question and answer chat, but I will try to say it again slowly. Okay. Can a tower company be classified as lessor and operator using the tower be classified as lease?
Lessee.
Lessee. Sorry.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. That is exactly how usually it would be approached. Yes, the tower co would be the lessor, and the network operator using the tower facilities would be the lessee. That is correct.
Okay. Okay, so I think for now there are no more questions. So thank you so much, Chris. Now I will give the floor to Alex Campbell, Senior Sustainability Consultant at TDC Net. Alex will explain us Category 11 on use of sold products. Hi, Alex, and the floor is yours.
Hi, Reina. Thank you so much. To start off, I'd like to give a special thanks to the project team who helped develop these standards. So specifically Lucia and Daniel from Telefonica, France from KPN, and Terry and Natalia from TELUS, and John from Dell. So the way that we approached this is going back a year and a half already at the start of this project. We took a look at what the big challenges were for each of the operators and also where the divergences were in how we were accounting for our inventories when it came to Category 11. Now, Category 11 is quite significant. It's usually in the top 3 biggest categories for telecommunications operators. And for that reason, it was especially important that we develop a bit more guidance for how operators can assess the emissions and evaluate them. So one of the big challenges that came up first off is that the method that's presented in the greenhouse gas protocol is quite labor intensive for devices that have a low emissions from the use phase. So the greenhouse gas protocol method, just to refresh your minds, is you take a look at the power consumption of a device over a year. So that's the power consumption, whether it's, for example, in a sleep mode and how much time it's in that mode, the user profiles, so more related to user behavior, and then the lifetime of the device. But when you take mobile phones, for example, you'll see that it is a lot of work to take a look at all the different mobile phones that are being sold, and the use phase is typically about 10%, which is quite low. So there are some shortcuts that can be applied in this case, which is using a product carbon footprint or an LCA study that's been done for the device, which gives the percentage or the kilograms of CO2 that are used over its lifetime. There's 2 main sources for this that operators are using. One is Apple's product environment report card, where for each product that they sell, they have a report card that shows what the lifetime emissions are. So they might say an iPhone 14 Pro has 65 kilograms and 11% of the emissions are from its use phase, something along those lines. Or there's also the Eco Rating Initiative that a number of telecoms operators are using that also give the lifetime or the use phase emissions. So in this case, it is a shortcut. It's a lot easier to use those numbers than to calculate, battery capacities, charging amount, the charges over the lifetimes and such. There's one sort of caveat with that, which is often they don't use very specific emission factors for the market where it's being sold. They'll use global or from the United States, for example. So that's just something to take into consideration in that one. For all other devices, then the greenhouse gas protocol method shall be applied. The recommended solution here is that focus on where you're going to get the most impact. For telecommunication operators, it's typically customer premise equipment. It'll be your routers and your setup boxes, for example, and focus on those to get the big emissions. The second biggest challenge was related to circularity and the circular economy. And if you read the greenhouse gas protocol itself, and you take a look at refurbishment of these CPE, these customer premise devices, you'll see that there's a bit of a disconnect. It's something that's not addressed in the greenhouse gas protocol. And for that reason, it leads to a lot of ambiguity and actually even being penalized for addressing circularity in your business, which is counterintuitive. Because the greenhouse gas protocol method says that you have to calculate the lifetime of the device, then the longer that you keep it in use, the more CO2 emissions occur. Conversely, you could say that, well, you buy less in your purchased goods and services, so it balances out. But we wanted to take a closer look at this and to make sure that we follow the greenhouse gas protocol, but we have a very specific reduction lever, which is refurbishment, which Simon addressed previously in this call. And basically what we say is that the refurbishment, you can put a lower lifetime on it. So you could say that the first time that a device is sold, you could say, and we give guidance on how to calculate the operational lifetime. Let's say it's 5 years. You could say that for refurbished devices, it's 3 years. And then, as Simon mentioned, for a refurbished device, you wouldn't take into account the cradle to gate for the production of it, only related to the refurbishment of the device itself. So you actually have quite a significantly lower CO2 footprint from a refurbished device now than from selling a new device. So this sort of gives you one more reduction lever in your portfolio. Another source of confusion that operators were seeing was indirect emissions. Now, in the greenhouse gas protocol, it says that they are optional. And it gives a few examples, but we noticed that between operators that some were including indirect emissions and some weren't. So to give you an example, if you have media content, like a TV channel, for example, well, you could argue that you can't watch TV channel without TV, right? Or if you sell a setup box to go with your TV, you could say, well, you can't watch TV on a setup box without a TV. So you're not selling TVs, but it's needed, so therefore it's indirect. So some operators would include those. Another one is when you take a look at use of sold products, you would say, well, a phone can't sort of reach its full design potential unless it has a subscription. So if you're selling a subscription but not the phone, then maybe you should consider that phones that you haven't sold in your use of sold products as an indirect emission. So what we've done in the guidance is say that they're optional, but recommended where it makes sense for you to assess the full impact of your company, and gives a little bit more recommendations around there. But one caution here, when it comes to developing your lever catalog and your marginal abatement curve for your reduction pathways, is that indirect emissions can be notoriously difficult to address. So if you say, like, if you sell a setup box, that you would include the television, well, how are you going to get more efficient televisions out there, and how are you going to stop people from watching more TV? It gets a little bit hairy and complicated. Next is the lifetime and the user profiles. These can be quite difficult to estimate. The industry association, JAC, recently did a survey amongst operators, taking a look at what the lifetime they attributed to each one of their devices, and there was some inconsistencies. Some are saying 3 years per device, other 5 years, other 8 years. So what we've written in the guidance is some operational or some indications, some recommendations on how to actually get the operational lifetime and how to estimate that. And if you don't have primary data or field data, how to use secondary data. But here, the reduction pathway, again, is that the longer they're in use, the argument is that the less you would buy new ones. And the last point here is related to where do you put customer premise equipment? Because for many operators, let's say if you get an internet subscription, the operator will send you a router to your house, but then when you're done with the contract, you would send the router back. So it's actually a downstream leased asset, financially speaking, and not a use of sold product. But when we addressed this, we said CPE should go in category 11, even if it's leased. And that's because the method is simply better suited for it. If you read in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol technical guidance for category 13, it's, and as Chris explained, it's a little bit unclear and it doesn't give very good guidance. Whereas category 11 is very well suited for devices that plug in and use electricity over the course of their lifetime. And by using category 11, then the recommended solution here is that we take a life cycle approach to emissions. So these are more levers that you can use to reduce this category's emissions. You limit the amount of new ones that you purchase. You refurbish as much as possible. You buy energy efficient. So if you're running a tender for CPE, make sure to look at the power consumption of the devices being bought and ideally putting a weight on it in the bid evaluation criteria. And then lastly, and possibly a bit more difficult, is influence user behavior. And that's it.
Thank you, Alex. We have a few questions for you. There are two questions that were also sent for Chris, but maybe we can address them later. There is one question that says, if operator A sells a used piece of active telecom equipment to operator B, whether anyone refurbishes it or not, the use phase emission of the equipment go into scope 1 and 2 of operator B, but also in scope 3, category 11 of operator A. Which on an accountable perspective may result in higher reported emissions for operator A compared to if they just dump it. So I think it was also a comment question.
Yeah, that is, I mean, it is typically true that when you get into category 12, end of life of sold products, which should be reflected the same as in the category 11 use of sold products, that the emissions from that are typically a lot lower. So yes, scrapping it is would result in a smaller emissions. But I mean, here we're talking about scope 3, but we can't forget the other environmental agendas as well, such as circularity and materials and waste. And here what we've tried to do is bring the carbon accounting and the circular economy together a bit closer, but you do need to address both. And it's not because you focus on one that you don't focus on the other.
Thank you, Alex. Now there is another common question. It seems incorrect to say that in general, more refurbishment leads to less CO2. For example, a too fast reconditioning leads to a faster purchase of new products, or too many reconditioning cycles of the same product led to increased emissions due to the refurbishing operations emissions themselves. How do you take this into account?
That's a very good question. But I mean, generally speaking, once the product is produced and on the market, the longer that it's on the market, the better, because the alternative would be to scrap it, right? So we want to keep the devices in operation for as long as possible. And we also want to make sure that our accounting methods reflect reality a bit closer. I mean, it'll be difficult to make it reflect reality 100%, specifically given the methods that are provided in the greenhouse gas protocol. But what we have done here is align them better. And we have addressed one part of the guidance itself specifically does say that does say that there is a connection between how long it's used in the first phase of its life, the first consumer, and how that might actually have an effect on the entire lifetime of the device itself. So I would like you to refer to the guidance to see more regarding that.
Thank you, Alex. Related to that, there was a comment, refurbishment emissions seems quite small in regard to manufacturing emissions, radio from 10 to 100 if I'm correct. Is it relevant to consider it?
Sorry, to consider the refurbishment itself?
I think the refurbishment emissions, I think that's what it's referring to in the question.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, there are going to be emissions from the refurbishment phase. I mean, you're going to have transportation to the refurbishment site and back. Some use refurbishment partners in other countries, for example, that are sent by truck. And then the refurbishment center itself is a workshop, so it does have emissions. So, I mean, it will be a lot smaller, but typically if you do have a refurbishment partner, you will have your procurement department should have spend on how much was spent on that refurbishment partner. So the data should be, at least spend data should be available to EEIO them, or if it's a partner who you can apply the supplier financial allocation method, then you can use that one too.
Thank you, Alex. There is another question that says, how do you account for green electricity used by customer? In theory, zero carbon.
This is extremely difficult. The fact is that basically we don't, we had a lot of discussions about it and we decided that we can't really determine that. So we do recommend using a location-based emission factor. Specifically, for example, for CPE, where you have hundreds of thousands or millions of devices going out onto the market, it would be basically impossible to track who's using green energy and who isn't. But I mean, if you would take one step back in the supply chain, for example, the producers of networking equipment, it might be easier because then they would have one really big contract with one company and a lot of devices going to that, and that one company would be paying for scope 2. But once it's diffused to in a B2C situation, it would be very difficult.
Thank you, Alex. There are some comments in the chat as well. Let me go through them. If customer premise equipment are not sold leased, do we still need to include it?
If they're not sold or leased?
Yes, if they are not sold or leased, yeah.
I'm not sure if they're not sold or leased, then is it the telecoms operator using them themselves? I mean, in that case, it would go in your scope 2.
Okay, this is a question from Niti Mittal. Then there was another comment from Andrea scrolling. The lower emissions for refurbished devices should be considered in category 1. In the use pace, from my point of view, only the length of the product use can make the difference. SBTi requires us to exclude indirect use phase emissions from third-party products. I think this is more of a comment. I don't know if if you want to say something on that.
No, I mean, here again, take the life cycle perspective to the emissions. So there is a link here between category 1 and 2 and category 11. So make sure that that you account for them appropriately using the methods presented in the guidance for each one of those categories.
Okay, so there are more comments. I see, for example, per SBTi criteria is only optional to include indirect use phase emission in the scope 3 inventory. Then it's also another comment, also the decrease in efficiency of a refurbished product vis-a-vis buying a next-gen product has to be accounted in use phase. Then I think this is the same. SBTi required us to exclude indirect use phase optional accounting from our SBTi scope 3 targets. So those are some comments in the chat, and let me see if there are so many other questions so we can move to the next speaker. Then there is one question that says the effect of the use of products are numerous and varied. It seems that only the energy consumption and the maintenance at the end of life of the product itself are taken into account, leaving aside the majority of the effects induced by their use. What about the other effect of the use? How are they taken into account or evaluated in order to evaluate the whole of the CO2 consequences of the customer's activity with the device?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure how to answer it, to be perfectly true. I mean, usually what you do is you take a look at the energy consumption in the device in the different modes. You take a look at the user profile, so how much people are using it in different modes, and a location-based emission factor, and the lifetime of the device. And I mean, once you have all of those, then you should have what's necessary to calculate it.
Perhaps, Alex, I could fill in. This is Pernilla Bergmark from Ericsson, co-rapporteur in question 9. I think this question is maybe about the distinction between first order effects, second order effect, and higher order effects. So the induced effects in other sectors and so on. So that is beyond what is accounted for in the greenhouse gas protocol.
Thank you, Pernilla. There is one last question, I think, Alex, from Pradeep Mahat. The duration of the first use of refurbished materials has a significant impact on the carbon assessment result. How the reporting of second use could consider this impact?
Yes, there is a paragraph that addresses this in the guidance itself. So I would recommend that the people who are interested in this take a closer look at the guidance itself.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. I think we don't have any more questions on the chat or on the question and answer. Now I would like to give the floor to Jean-Manuel Canet, co-rapporteur of question 9 and ITU and senior manager Orange. Jean-Manuel will explain the other categories. The floor is yours, Jean-Manuel.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex, Pernilla, and Reina. So let's go through the other categories. And first of all, I would like to thank all the participants who contributed to these topics of all the categories, with some special thanks to Pernilla again from Ericsson, co-rapporteur of question 9, to Ahmed Haddad from ARCEP, to Anders Andre from Huawei, to François from Bélanger from Orange, and Anna Duraku from Telia. And also Chris Toppen from GeSI, and John Puger from Dell, who they all participated in all of these topics, and I thank them very much. So on the all other categories, we have we identified some specific challenges. The first of these challenges is on category 3, which is related to upstream energy. And we have noticed, when we looked at the emissions, the scope 3 emissions of the operators, that this can represent a significant amount of telecom operators' emissions. So it is quite an important category. What we did is that based on the existing GEG protocol text, we described we provided some indication on how to assess these category 3 emissions. So you will get some guidance on that in the document. And of course, if the operators want to reduce their category 3 emissions, they can use, they can source renewable energy, and this is leading to lower CO2 in this category. The other challenge that we wanted to mention is the fact that even if not major contributors to Scope 3, all other categories shall be taken into account because there may be some specific contexts that make that a specific category is relatively important for an operator. And also because we need reductions in all aspects of, let's say, the Scope 3. So here as well, the guidance describes with some details how to assess other categories emissions. And for each category, of course, several types of actions can lead to CO2 reductions. Just to give some examples, encouraging alternative transport, freight, or alternative travel means, using more train, for instance, can lead obviously to CO2 equivalent reductions. Another specific category is the one of investments. This one is a category 15, and it may also represent a significant part of Scope 3. And here the guidance as well describes with some details, and you will be able to read that, how to assess investments related emissions. Here, in particular, it is recommended that a dialogue with the investee companies can lead to identification and implementation of some reduction levers. And the last point that we wanted to mention is the fact that, a specific challenge is to encourage clear and transparent reporting on Scope 3 emissions from let's say, for all the operators. And the text, the guidance, lists the items that the reporting of Scope 3 shall contain. This has been done in coherence with the ITUT L.1420 recommendation, which provides guidance on how to assess GHG emissions for ICT organizations. And so this, it is recommended that providing transparent, clear reporting. Also, this will help to identify the reduction levers, because when you know, obviously when you can measure, when you can know an impact, you can better act on it, you can better model how to act on it, how to reduce it, and how to do this with all the involved parties, because of course, generally the Scope 3 let's say, action implies a strong dialogue with other supply chain parties, let's say. So that was it for the all other categories. I thank you for this.
Thank you, John Manuel. I don't see right now any questions in the chat. Sorry, any question in the question and answer. Let me check the chat. There are no also comments in the chat. If I may, if Chris, are you available while people think if they have any questions for the part on other categories? There were two questions that we did not address before on your part. One is related to production manufacturing emissions is optional for category 8 and 13. However, if one company lesser decides to report the emission for category 8, then GeSI should also report that for emission balance. How does it work?
Okay, thank you. I think I replied in the Q&A.
You did. Sorry, yes, you did.
Yes, but it's a good question, and just in case people haven't read the response, then if a lessee who's reporting as category 8 wishes to opt to report the upstream emissions, then the asset that they're reporting about would have been purchased by the lessor, and the lessor, having purchased the asset, would then be reporting it as category 1 or 2. And so that's how it would work. In essence, if someone is choosing to opt to report the upstream emissions within their category 8 emission ledger, then it would have been purchased and reported, or should have been purchased and reported by the lessor. And there was another question as well, which I also put in an answer.
Yeah, do you want me to read it? Or you already answered, so.
I think I have already answered.
Yeah.
And that was
if the tower co and operator are from the same group and only the group reporting, can they consider scope 1 and 2?
Yes. So if the tower co and the operator are both within the same group, and it's the group that's reporting, then the group would report it as scope 1 and 2. If it's the subsidiaries that are reporting, in other words, the tower co is a subsidiary and the operator is a subsidiary, then one of the entities should report it as scope 1 and 2, and the other report it as scope 3. And then which would follow the guidance that we've laid out for categories 8 and 13. So hopefully that answers those 2 questions.
It seems it does, because we don't have any more questions in the chat. And now we are almost to the end of the program. Now we have left 15 minutes for any other question that you will have regarding the whole presentation from the different categories. So if you have any other question, we can address them now. Now we have a question from Francois. It says, how should diversification activities non-telco be taken into account with telco activities, or always separately? Alex, would you like, or Manuel?
Maybe I can answer this one. Yes. So thank you, Francois. So the activities, and there is some guidance included in the short guidance included in the document. Activities which are not related to telecommunication activities should be taken into account, but shall be reported separately, because the nature of the activity is different. And so it may be covered through other kinds of guidance, and it should be reported separately.
Thank you, Jean-Manuel. So we don't have any more questions. I will give a couple of minutes to see. It has been a very good participation with at some moment or over 100 participants connected. Now we have 93. Let me see, there seems is a comment in the chat. How do we benchmark the energy consumption of electronic devices to contain CO2 emission?
Here, I can take that one. Often when you're doing a tender for buying new CPE specifically, the producers of the equipment will send models to your team. And in our case, we do have a team of people in our network department who will benchmark it. So they will test the power consumption in the different modes. They'll do it with the Wi-Fi turned on, Wi-Fi turned off, with different upload and download rates. And then the important part is to choose something that's most reflective of a typical user scenario. So, and then for it to be consistent across all the models being bought. If you do that in the tender process itself and you put a weight on it in the bid evaluation criteria, then your decision, it'll guide your decision into which CPE to purchase a bit better. And it could result in, and it could influence what the final product that ends up on the market is, and therefore what your category 11 emissions are.
Thank you, Alex. Now let us see if there are more questions in the question and answer. Well, I think we don't have any more questions. And now I would like to, well, wait. Every time I see that, then there is an additional comment from the previous question from Krishna Sahai. Is the benchmarking binding on the manufacturer? Alex?
Is the benchmarking what, sorry?
Binding on the manufacturer.
Well, this is the thing that the guidance does address, is that it should reflect the operational conditions of once it's been sold. So when you take a look at the devices that you buy from a manufacturer, it will say the expected power consumption, possibly the expected lifetime, etc. But it could be good for you to actually get them in the hands of somebody who can do the benchmarking themselves internally at your company, and get them to run the tests on them. Just to double sure. I personally have seen, or our teams have seen, some discrepancies between what's in the user manual and what's actually sent to us.
Sahai is saying, I mean any statutory enforcement.
In the guidance, it does talk about the EU has, let me see if I could just find it, but there is an EU legislation on the electricity consumption of devices. But you can find that in the text. There is a reference to it.
So many thanks, Alex, and many thanks to all the participants, to all the other experts that also presented the different categories. Now, before we end, I would also like to give the floor to Stephen Moore from GSMA. He will give some short closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Raina. Yeah, I mean, just to say a huge thank you for all the comments, the engagement, the questions that we've had today. I think that's really helped explain the guidance in a bit more detail. Just to flag, we are doing another session covering the same content that we did today. We'll be doing it this evening, although for Simon Anthony it will be tomorrow because he's in Australia. So if you did want to take some time today to read through the guidance in more detail, you're very welcome to join us again, perhaps to ask some follow-up questions at this evening's session. And then also to flag that we're recording the session. So we're recording the session today. We'll be recording the session this evening. If you you missed anything, you want to recap, we will be circulating the recordings as well. And perhaps, Raina, you can give some details on the circulation of the recordings. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Can the content be shared? Yes, it will be shared. You will have it tomorrow, the presentation and the recordings. We have prepared a website that I put the link on the chat. In this website, you have the draft, the program, you have the pre-published version of the guide, and you will also have tomorrow the presentation and the recordings. So thank you so much. So as Stephen mentioned, if you have any other colleague also that missed the session today, please feel free to let them know that we will have the same session today in the evening. It will be Geneva time from 9 to 10:45. That it also allows the participation from Latin American countries or North American countries. So thank you so much to all, and the session is closed. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Rainer, and everybody.
Thank you so
Rainer.
much, Reina, Stephen.